As a publisher, it's partially about trying to play a part in dignifying the identity of people who have been oppressed, thrown in a closet, kicked while they were there. What is it worth to finally give dignity to somebody who looks a certain way or is a certain way, who has not had that, or whose people has not had that?
Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. Today my guest is Tim McKee, publisher of North Atlantic Books, a nonprofit press with a 50-year legacy of advancing healing, consciousness, and cultural transformation. North Atlantic Books has long been aligned with a similar spirit that animates Esalen, which I would identify as a commitment to somatics, to trauma-informed healing, and the willingness to platform voices that are working at the edges of personal and collective awakening. The catalog at North Atlantic Books includes seminal works ranging from The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Francis Weller to Gabor Maté's In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. These are books that helped introduce somatic and trauma-based healing to the broader culture. Other notable books they publish include Black Psychedelic Revolution by Nicholas Powers, Mystery School in Hyperspace by Graham St. John, A Cultural History of DMT, Reclaiming Ugly by Vanessa Rochelle Lewis, and coming soon, Antifascist Dad from the Conspirituality podcast host Matthew Remski. In this conversation, Tim and I explore how publishing at its best can and should be a liberatory act, how the personal and the political have become difficult to separate in the current landscape. And then we attempt to delve into the issues surrounding publishing marginalized and emergent voices. Tim is a super cool guy. He's thoughtful, grounded, unafraid to sit with complexity. So with no further ado, here's our conversation. Tim McKee, thanks so much for joining us today on Voices of Esalen. It's a pleasure to get the chance to talk with you.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here.
You are the publisher of North Atlantic Books, and for people who don't know about North Atlantic Books, can you tell us a little bit about the DNA of this house?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been publishing for 51 years. We're a nonprofit organization, which is somewhat rare in book publishing. There's some allies I have who fit that description, but that distinguishes us. We're tied to capitalism and kind of commercialism in an interesting way because we're a client of Penguin Random House. So, we pay them to sell and distribute our books. They don't own us. We're not like part of their operation, except as a client. There's about 50 publishers who fit that. And that's very nice because we can kind of offer the benefits of a relatively small nonprofit, 25 people or so, but then kind of guarantee that every book we publish at least gets onto the highway of book publishing, of book selling, of book buying. So, some books sell a lot, some don't sell that many, but they all have an equal chance to get on the shelves, to be found. And we really focus on publishing books about healing, tools for healing people. We tend to kind of look for modalities of healing or foci of healing that are a little bit off the map when we're publishing, not to the people who know about it, but to kind of most people. And we kind of try to push that in to the mainstream conversation. So one of our best-selling books is a book called The Vital Psoas Muscle. It's completely specific, based on anatomy and kind of an anatomy nerd kind of book. But yeah, lots of people talk about the psoas now, it turns out. But when we were first publishing it, people probably even at North Atlantic Books had to look it up. Another example might be, in general, trauma and somatics. I think that is what we're most known for. Because we've been at it for so long. I think it was 1991 that we published Peter Levine's classic Waking the Tiger. So, that goes way back, and he certainly is a pioneer within somatics. Another example would be Gabor Maté's book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, and, the way that trauma and addiction are linked. So I remember before I started at NAB that my colleagues who've been there for a while told me that when we were first publishing books about trauma and somatics, that the Penguin Random House sales reps asked us for a glossary of, basic terms because it was just so new. So now, of course, there's so many books on trauma. Fortunately, trauma is really talked about. This is a positive development. So in that way, we've kind of done our work to publish the people who are blazing the trail in an important healing modality that the world needs to know about.
It seems in a certain sense that this is Esalen aligned. I mean, Peter Levine taught at Esalen, and conceptions of somatic healing are very based to the work that's done here. Would you say that North Atlantic Books is overtly political, or is that something that is more like a byproduct of the work that's done?
Great question. I think that's changed over time. I think that NAB always published some political books, but kind of strove to be apolitical. And I would not say that is true now for a very specific reason, which is that the politics is personal, and that if we talk about self-help or personal growth without linking it to the way that the world around us impacts our bodies, impacts our healing, we're missing, at least half of healing. So there's really no way to talk about wellness and politics or wellness and healing without talking about collective liberation, without talking about justice, and in that way, politics. We don't publish politics with like a big P in terms of like a partisan piece, especially as a nonprofit.
Sure.
But yeah, we feel like we wouldn't be doing our job or living our mission unless we push the envelope on healing, which is both making sure that a kind of link to the outside is part of any of our books, even if they're focused on something specific inside our bodies or quite individual, that we have some part of the book that ties it to what's around us. And then I think the other place we push the envelope is, I think normally when healing was talked about, what was centered as the normative experience or the normative body, even though this may have not been said explicitly, was a white hetero body. And obviously the global majority doesn't fit that. So really looking at the way that healing impacts folks, depending on what they look like. I wish that wasn't so, but of course it is. But also what medicine people who are outside of that norm have to bring to our conversation. Because certainly Western thought and Western thinking hasn't really gotten us into a great position. You might say that we're about to die on that hill.
I've made a concerted effort to ensure that more marginalized voices, so to speak, have gotten access and traction on the Voices of Esalen podcast, because in certain senses, what you talk about, this idea that the default body receiving healing is the white male body, that has been criticism that was leveled against Esalen. And I speak at Esalen about the history here, and it's one of my greatest pleasures to do so. But when I look at a lot of the voices that were sort of lionized 60s and 70s, again, white male voices, not to the exclusion of everybody, but it's the majority. So just curious, is there a concerted effort to ensure that diverse voices get their time with North Atlantic Books? Or is this sort of like a side effect?
It's been intentional. And we started by first looking at our own data, looking at the identity of who we were publishing. And when I first started measuring that about 10 years ago, we were publishing 90% white folks and 75% men. And that was interesting data. It surprised some people internally because they hadn't ever really looked at the numbers. But for other people internally, it wasn't surprising at all. But so then the work really began to change that. And these days, our front list is almost not flipped, but I think 60% of our authors are women and gender expansive folks. It's about 50-50 racially, ethnically. So I'm glad those numbers have changed, but that didn't come by accident or like wishing for it. It wasn't manifested. It was really trying to integrate those lenses, a gender justice lens, a trans justice lens, a racial justice lens, into all of our departments. And both so that we were looking and working to find a diverse set of books, but also that as our own staff, which is mixed, as we were working with the author, that we weren't kind of imposing white supremacy and heteronormativity onto them, so that their experience within our house wasn't like they were invited to the party, but they were kind of dealt with a lot of microaggressions and went home and said, well, I wish I hadn't gone to that house. So, I think like opening the welcoming door is a huge part. But I think the harder work is actually being responsive to folks and, yeah, really working to listen and to accommodate. Increasingly, we work with a lot of self-identified neurodivergent folks. And I think that's always been so, but there really wasn't the lens for it or the language for it when I first came 10 years ago. And you know what? A lot of our processes are super neurotypical. Here's this deadline. Here's this Google Doc with all of these edits. This is what you need to do, expecting that someone is going to email like you do or only want to talk on the phone when you do. And our staff is quite neurodivergent, diverse as well. Actually, neurodivergent would be the proper term there. Neurodiversity is what we hold. So yeah, we had to look at some of our systems there and realize we need to be flexible so that what we're expecting and how we're working are at least, workable for an author from an identity like that.
Yeah, identity is interesting because I feel like something happened in our culture that's sort of like landmarked with the election that happened in November 2024, where it's like the equity work that had been done over, let's date it back to 2020. It was jeered at in a public way. It was invalidated, right? And I'm not just talking about the people on the right. I feel like there was this idea that because Trump was elected with the popular vote, that there was this sort of like, let's all agree that the mainstream has gone too far with regards to identity politics. But even more so than that, I think that there was this idea of certain folks, a pushback against them having legitimized identities at all. Do you feel like identity is a central thematic for your publishing house?
Yes, for sure. And I know what you're talking about. And I've heard it myself, that critique like, well, we would have won if all these people in San Francisco weren't constantly talking about trans rights, that kind of thing.
Right. Exactly.
And I don't buy that whatsoever for a few reasons. One, that's just a theory of why the Democrats lost. It can't be proven. The other problem with that is that it centers kind of mainstream political electoral success, which is important, but it centers it as the most important thing. And my response to that is, what is it worth to finally give dignity to somebody who looks a certain way or is a certain way, who has not had that, or whose people has not had that? What is that worth? So, as a publisher, it's partially about trying to play a part in dignifying the identity of people who have been oppressed, thrown in a closet, kicked while they were there. But what's interesting is that might seem like a small readership, and that's okay too. Like, we have a book called Transcending, which is an anthology of trans Buddhists. There's a lot of them. Western American Buddhism might not make one think that's true in terms of who's talked about, but it's true. And it's really important that we publish that book, even though it probably hasn't sold that many. The people who bought it and read it have told us that it was meaningful to see themselves, to kind of find themselves in the book. But also, sometimes some of these emergent identities are quite large, and also readership can expand outside of them. So we have a book called Regretting Motherhood. It was published like 10 years ago. And when we first presented the book to Penguin Random House, they were not getting it. And the book had kind of moderate sales. It is a very strong seller now. And so what is that emergent identity? That is an emergent identity of women who aren't sure if they want to have children. And they had books that were like, here's all the reasons to have a child. Then they had these books like A Guide to a Child-Free Life. And like both those areas are good. But like, what about hearing from women who had children, who love their children, but who actually can identify with regret about that? And interestingly, the regret was not about actually having children. It was about how their lives kind of were forced to change and contort due to the way that society views mothers and parenting. So that book is now very well read by, I'd say, Gen Z and millennial readers mostly, who want to hear that. They want the straight stuff. Right?
I can't think of another title that would be more in opposition with the dominant conservative ideological framework right now.
Exactly. And, one of our authors, Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, co-author of Radical Dharma, she sometimes sends me 1-star reviews that she finds. And she said, I value these as much as the 5-star reviews because I successfully, stirred good trouble.
So what is it like for you to be publisher of North Atlantic Books, at this time in this specific political climate where the views that you're espousing are pretty much in direct opposition to the ones that are being pushed out into the mainstream?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it certainly seems like these times call for courage and to use whatever platforms, positions, powers that we may have. But there's been moments where I myself have wavered. For instance, some of our organization's racial equity work, which is ongoing, and we realize that even though we've been at it for several years and have moved the organization quite far, there was still a lot of work to do. There was still white supremacy culture absolutely still baked in to processes, to assumptions, to the way meetings are run. And so our racial equity committee said, you know what, let's kind of do a report, and non-judgmentally, but let's do an audit in a way of like the work we've done so we can learn from other departments, but also see where we really have some growth spots. And right about when they were going to embark on that, Trump came out with that executive order kind of like banning DEI within federal agencies. And it scared me, even though we're not a federal agency. Our nonprofit status is very important to us. And I balked in a meeting with the Racial Equity Committee where I was like, I worry that this might come back to hurt us. A young colleague of mine who is the co-chair of that meeting, who's a Hmong American, she was shaken and she was disappointed, which she told me later. And she said to me, like, I understand being scared, but I really do feel like you need to be courageous here and have more skin in the game. So one, I'm grateful for her directness. I'm grateful that we have an environment where she could say that to the publisher, but also it had me realize, what the price of that might be, that kind of subservience to the fear, and what that felt like in my body, which on one hand kind of felt like relief and safety, but on a deeper level felt like a violation of my own principles. But it took me some work to get there. And so we absolutely are doing the audit. We're in the middle of it. We proceeded fearlessly after my fearful hiccup.
I mean, do you think about preparing for a future where publishing in general or publishing at North Atlantic Books could come under some sort of ideological attack? Or do you think about resilience or alternative pathways for the work?
Yeah, great question. I feel fortunate that we're not structured or in a way where we would have that kind of silencing happening.
Mhm.
Penguin Random House gives us advice, but they can't tell us what to do. So we can take it or not. As a nonprofit, we don't have any shareholders or, profit makers from our venture. And fortunately, I think because of a lot of the work we've done as a collective, both on the staff level and the board level, we don't always agree. But I haven't been in a position where I've seen a significant attempt to silence something that was radical. But certainly, if I was an academic publisher, I would have a much different answer to that question, I imagine. The corporate publishers, this is no shade on them, but their ideology is profit making. So in some
Yeah.
ways, their ideology is apolitical. So, they publish something that might be really liberatory to me on one day. And then the next week, they might publish something that is super reactionary. To be honest with you, I'm a little more worried about reading in some ways. Most nonfiction publishers are having a really hard year this year. I think what's happening is that on the one hand, those of us who are publishing books that are pushing envelopes and being more inclusive in the conversation, I think there was a period, after George Floyd's murder and COVID, where there were a lot of people coming to a new understanding of systemic racism, non-binary folks, and we're actually trying to learn. So a lot of our books had the core audience, but it kind of had newcomers, which we welcomed. And I feel like with the rise of Trumpism 2.0, ideologically, they've built a wall around all of those subjects, all of those perspectives with an arrow that says bad. And sadly, people, whether they like it or not, like I did in that moment, really give into fear. And I then think aren't coming to those books. And then our core audience for those books is exhausted. I'm not saying they're not reading, but I think there was a period, the last 5 years where, ooh, I want to sign up for that course. Ooh, I want to learn about that. I'm going to read this book. Ooh, my friends and I have challenged each other to read 40 books a year. That period was very good for nonfiction book publishers. The book areas that are the most right now is romantasy and the Bible.
All right.
Yeah. So,
It's disturbing to say the least. But look, I want to offer you at least a public thank you and a public appreciation for the work that North Atlantic Books does. I've had several of the authors on this show, including Laura Mae Northrup. Jacoby Ballard was just a guest recently. It's a frightening time. It honestly is. I want to bring up this concept of what does it actually take to sustain deep friendships across lines of race or class or even politics,
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's finding that balance between avoiding two extremes. One extreme would be we're friends because of our souls, and what you look like is immaterial to me. I mean, I get that, and I do believe in soul friendship, but that is going to limit that friendship, I think, because the person who isn't sharing your identity, who might have taken a lot of shit their whole lives for that identity, it's a big part of them. Reverend Angel, who I mentioned earlier, she said to me once, I may not wake up feeling like a queer Black woman, but by lunchtime, America has made that abundantly clear. So, and then on the other hand, if I'm obsessing over the identity of the person and kind of like over genuflecting or, well, I can't really say that person upset me, that friend upset me because of their identity. So avoiding both of those extremes, which to me looks like curiosity about their experience, their life experience in this world, given their identity. And not being afraid to ask questions about that. And then also really thinking in the friendship about that same question. How has my identity, shaped who I am? And all of the, with women, it might be my assumption of safety and how rarely I go into a situation expecting to feel unsafe versus obviously by having female friends, I have learned that for most women, that experience of living with threat is every day, often. So, that's not, it's from listening and asking questions. And then also doing some homework based on, these conversations with friends and learning from them, but not expecting them to be my trainer. It's kind of like, oh, wow, I've never thought about that. Or wow, what an interesting experience. And then really like expecting them to educate me, doing my own work there. So, or being friends with young folks right now and listen, my son's 20, so I'm happy to say some of his friends are my friends, listening to what it's like to, first of all, be left with a world by us that's on the brink of disaster, but also little like arrogant opinions about their generation related to iPhones and TikToks, for instance. I call that out when people my age and older get on that track because we don't know shit unless we're listening to what a 20-year-old is experiencing. And most of the ones I know have a very empowered relationship with TikTok in terms of what they learn. The amount of time they spend on it, they admit to me, can get a bit unmanageable. But that only comes from listening. And I think that's the only way to sustain those relationships. And I think also creating spaces like in our home here, where it does feel like a safe house for people of different identities.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore really creating a container of getting to know each other deeper around the dinner table. That does build friendships and it builds community. And are there tricky parts or awkward moments? For sure.
Mm-hmm.
But I would view life to be very boring if I was not at this edge of learning and growth. I don't know. It's like a party that I went to where everybody looked at me. I think when I was 20, I probably wouldn't have even noticed it, to be honest.
Right.
It certainly would have felt normal. I got to say that if I'm at a party like that these days, I'm usually questioning it pretty quickly. And I feel less safe with men myself. And, I have close male friendships and there's a lot of exceptions to that. But yeah, thank the goodness for these friendships and communities that truly integrate difference.
Do you feel like with the work that you do and the way that you live your life, that you're in the business of changing minds?
Yeah, because I think that a book still can do that. I think almost everybody has some shelf where they have the books that change their life. Those books are often dog-eared and underlined and a little bit tattered, right? I know where I have those books. And I see this, like sometimes when we're at a book festival and our books will be out, someone will come and see a book that we've published and they will tell us specifically about how it changed their life and what happened as a result of reading the book. I do think there is something still seen as sacred to reading a book. And I still see people with a book out on the subway. I mean, it's still happening. So, and then I think for the thinker, the writer, the healer, absolutely publishing a book is life-changing. It's a big deal to have a book published. When we go to talks and you hear the person introduced, if they've published a book, the host mentions it. It's very gratifying for me to see the way that some of our authors' own lives have changed from them publishing this book. So that doesn't have to do with sales, but it's interesting to me, the books that sell well for us, we probably wouldn't have predicted it when we first talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, there's still a little bit of like, and this is partially an anti-capitalist view, but like there's something kind of like pleasantly surprising and poetic about the fact that something can be very radical and uncompromising in a book, and it still might sell quite well. Reverend Angel's book, Radical Dharma, it's probably like 12 years now. I think it's sold 50 or 60,000 copies by now. The average book in the United States sells about 1,800 units in its lifetime. So it's hard to sell books. And I'm no longer surprised by this, but I love that it's true. And the kind of corollary to that is when we have pursued books that this feels pretty mainstreamy, like might be too mainstreamy for us, but no, it's good. And like this might sell a lot because it's very accessible, popular, a little milquetoast. We don't do well with those books. It's kind of contrary to logic, but it's a logic that I'm grateful for.
Do you have any books that are currently lighting you up right now at North Atlantic Books?
We've got Psychedelic Plant Medicines of the Americas. Bia Labate and folks in San Francisco are doing it. It's coming out next year. And this is like really kind of a holistic, plant-based and also indigenous-based reference book for, what are the psychedelic plants in, the Americas, and what's the history of them? What are the uses of them? What's the culture of them? So we love doing these kind of like studies, these kind of practical workbook type books that cover something that feels really important, but that might be underreported. Another one I'm excited about is Growing Papaya Trees, Nurturing Indigenous Roots During Climate Displacement. And this is a second book by Dr. Jessica Hernandez, who's a young indigenous woman who lives in the state of Washington. And her books are about indigenous science. And like, first of all, what amazing concepts have been established in indigenous science, but also how essential they are to us right now and how kind of underutilized they've been. So those are two books that really have me excited.
That was Tim McKee, publisher of North Atlantic Books. Thanks for listening to Voices of Esalen. The show is produced in conjunction with Shira Levine. Our theme music is by Nico Holloman. If you want to learn more about Tim's work or explore North Atlantic Books' catalog, you'll find links in our show notes. And of course, you can always learn more about Esalen, our workshop, our mission, this ongoing experiment we call human potential at esalen.org. So as always, thanks for listening. If this conversation resonated, please feel free to share it, leave us a review, or send the episode to a friend who might need it. Until next time, take good care of yourself, stay curious, keep going deeper.